Welcome back to Trending Update USA. I'm Stefan, and today we're asking a bigger question than just who won or lost a tennis match. What does real growth actually look like in modern sports? Is it measured by trophies, or by how an athlete responds when everything doesn't go their way? Because what we saw after Coco Gauff's loss to Aryna Sabalenka at the Miami Open might quietly be one of the most important moments of her career, not because of the result, but because of what came after it. Let's start with what actually happened. Gauff entered the Miami Open with strong expectations. She's a Grand Slam champion, a face of the next generation, and someone many fans believe should be consistently competing for the biggest titles. On the other side, Sabalenka came in as one of the most dominant and physically powerful players on tour. When they met, it was a clash of styles, Gauff's speed and defense against Sabalenka's raw aggression and shot-making. The match itself followed a familiar pattern we've seen before. Sabalenka controlled the tempo, dictated play, and ultimately came out on top. It wasn't just about power, it was about confidence, clarity, and execution under pressure. For Gauff, it was another reminder that the gap between being great and being dominant is still something she's actively working to close. But here's where things get interesting. Because the real story didn't end when the final point was played. What stood out wasn't frustration, excuses, or visible collapse. It was composure. It was honesty. It was awareness. And that's where we begin to see what true growth actually looks like. In earlier stages of her career, moments like this sometimes brought visible emotional swings. That's normal, especially for someone who rose to global fame as a teenager. When you break through that early, expectations don't just grow, they explode. Every match becomes a statement. Every loss becomes a headline. But this time, something felt different. Gauff didn't try to hide from the loss. She didn't over-explain it. She acknowledged it. She understood it. And more importantly, she framed it as part of a longer journey, not a defining failure. That shift might seem small on the surface, but in elite sports, it's everything. Because growth at this level isn't just about improving your backhand or serve. It's about developing the mental framework to survive constant scrutiny, pressure, and comparison. Think about the environment she's operating in. At just 20 years old, Gauff isn't just competing against opponents, she's navigating an entire ecosystem of expectations. Media narratives constantly ask whether she's fulfilling her potential. Social media debates every performance in real time. Fans compare her to past champions and current rivals after every match. That kind of pressure doesn't just test your game, it tests your identity. And this is where her response to the Sabalenka loss becomes so meaningful. Instead of reacting emotionally, she responded intellectually. She showed an ability to separate the result from her self-worth. She recognized the areas she needs to improve without letting the loss define her. That's not something every athlete figures out early. In fact, many don't figure it out at all. Because modern sports, especially tennis, are uniquely demanding in terms of mental resilience. There's no team to hide behind. No substitutions. No breaks where someone else takes over. It's just you, your thoughts, and your opponent. And when things go wrong, they go wrong publicly. Every double fault is replayed. Every mistake is analyzed. Every loss is debated. Now add social media to that equation. Platforms like X, Instagram, and TikTok have completely changed the athlete experience. Players aren't just competing on the court, they're constantly being evaluated off it. Comments, criticism, praise, and pressure are all delivered instantly, often without context or understanding. For someone like Gauff, who grew up in the digital era, this is the reality she's always known. But that doesn't make it easier. If anything, it makes emotional discipline even more important. And this is where her growth really stands out. After the loss, there was no defensive tone. No subtle blame shifting. No emotional outburst directed at herself or external factors. Instead, there was clarity. She recognized Sabalenka's strengths. She acknowledged the level required to compete at the top. And she positioned the loss as information, not as failure. That mindset shift, from emotional reaction to analytical reflection, is a hallmark of elite maturity. It's the difference between asking, "Why did I lose?" and asking, "What does this teach me?" And that's a powerful place to be. Because once an athlete reaches that level of self-awareness, improvement becomes intentional rather than reactive. Let's also talk about Sabalenka for a moment. She represents one of the biggest challenges in women's tennis right now. Her game is built on relentless aggression, physical strength, and confidence under pressure. When she's playing at her best, she forces opponents into uncomfortable positions almost immediately. For Gauff, facing that kind of opponent exposes very specific areas for growth, particularly in handling pace, taking control of rallies, and maintaining offensive consistency. But instead of viewing that as a weakness, she appears to be embracing it as a roadmap. And that's another sign of growth. Because the best athletes don't just want to win, they want to understand why they win and why they lose. They study patterns. They analyze matchups. They build long-term solutions instead of short-term fixes. And that's exactly the phase Gauff seems to be entering. Now, let's zoom out even further. Why does this moment matter beyond one match? Because it reflects a broader shift in how young athletes are navigating fame, pressure, and identity. In previous generations, players were often expected to suppress emotion, avoid vulnerability, and maintain a certain image at all costs. Today's athletes are operating in a very different environment, one where authenticity is more visible, but also more scrutinized. Gauff represents a new kind of athlete, one who is open, thoughtful, and self-aware, but also under constant observation. Balancing those things is not easy. There's a fine line between being accessible and protecting your mental space. And that brings us to another important layer of this conversation: privacy. In modern sports, privacy has become a luxury. Every press conference is dissected. Every social media post is interpreted. Even silence can be turned into a narrative. For a young athlete, that creates a unique challenge. How do you grow, make mistakes, and learn when the entire world is watching in real time? Gauff's response to the Miami Open loss suggests she's beginning to find that balance. She's engaging with the moment, but not being consumed by it. She's acknowledging the loss, but not internalizing it as a personal failure. She's staying present, while still protecting her long-term perspective. And that's incredibly difficult to do. Because the temptation, especially after a high-profile loss, is to react immediately. To explain everything. To justify the result. To respond to every narrative. But sometimes, growth looks like restraint. It looks like choosing not to overreact. It looks like trusting the process, even when the outcome isn't what you wanted. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Now, does this mean Gauff has solved everything? Of course not. She's still developing her game. Still refining her strategy. Still learning how to handle different types of opponents. But the key difference is how she's approaching that process. There's a sense of patience now. A sense of perspective. And those qualities often separate good players from great ones. Because talent can take you far, but mindset determines how far you ultimately go. Let's also consider the expectations placed on her. Since her breakthrough at Wimbledon as a teenager, Gauff has been labeled as the future of tennis. Every performance is measured against that narrative. Every result is interpreted through that lens. That kind of expectation can be both motivating and overwhelming. It pushes you to improve, but it also creates constant pressure to prove something. And that's why moments like this matter. Because they show how an athlete is managing that pressure internally. Gauff isn't just trying to meet expectations, she's learning how to define success on her own terms. And that's a critical step in long-term development. Because if your identity is tied solely to winning, every loss becomes a crisis. But if your identity is tied to growth, learning, and improvement, losses become part of the journey. That doesn't make them easy, but it makes them meaningful. And that's what we're seeing here. A loss that, on paper, might look like a setback, but in reality, might be a step forward. So what does this mean moving forward? It means Gauff is building something deeper than just results. She's building resilience. She's building understanding. She's building a mindset that can sustain success over time, not just achieve it once. And in a sport as demanding as tennis, that might be the most important thing of all. Because careers aren't defined by a single match. They're defined by how you respond to moments like this, over and over again. And right now, Gauff's response is pointing in the right direction. As fans, it's easy to focus on wins and losses, to celebrate victories and question defeats. But sometimes, the most important developments happen in the background, in the way an athlete thinks, reacts, and evolves. And that's what makes this moment worth paying attention to. It's not just about losing to Sabalenka. It's about what that loss reveals. About mindset. About maturity. About the quiet, often invisible process of becoming better. And in a world that's constantly chasing immediate results, that kind of growth is easy to overlook, but incredibly valuable. Because in the long run, it's not just about how high you rise. It's about how well you adapt, how deeply you understand yourself, and how consistently you keep moving forward. That's what turns potential into legacy. And that's why this moment matters, far beyond tennis. Thanks for watching Trending Update USA. I'm Stefan. Before you go, here are 3 quick questions for you. Do you think mindset is more important than skill at the highest level of sports? Can social media pressure actually slow down an athlete's development? And after this loss, do you believe Coco Gauff is getting closer to becoming the most complete player on tour?